I had no idea my best friend's husband would ever look at me that way, let alone say the words that just came out of his mouth. We were in the middle of a crowded cocktail party at their house, the kind of upscale gathering where everyone pretended their lives were perfect, their marriages intact, and their desires well contained. Soft jazz played from the speakers, wine glasses clinked, and laughter filled the space like a well-rehearsed performance. I was on my second glass of Chardonnay, pleasantly buzzed, just enough to ignore the underlying tension that always hung in the air between couples who'd been married too long. That's when Mark leaned in, his lips barely moving, his voice a deep, low vibration against my ear. "I think about you more than I should." I swallowed hard, pulse skipping. My best friend's husband, tall, handsome, successful Mark, with his too perfect smile and his charming laugh that had always been reserved for Olivia. I turned my head just slightly, enough to catch his expression. There was nothing playful about it, no teasing smirk, just intent. I should have been offended. I should have walked away, found Olivia, and told her what her husband had just whispered to me. But I didn't, because the truth was, I had noticed him too, more than I should. I had watched the way he moved, the way he carried himself, the way his shirt stretched over his broad shoulders. It had been harmless, until now. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, feigning innocence, but my voice betrayed me. It wavered, my breath coming just a little too fast. Mark chuckled under his breath, his fingers grazing my wrist as he reached for his drink. A touch so quick, so light. It could have been nothing, but it wasn't. It was intentional, and it sent a shiver through me. I scanned the room, heart pounding. Olivia was across the patio, deep in conversation with a group of women, completely unaware of what was happening just feet away. It should have been enough to snap me out of it. It wasn't. Mark straightened, taking a sip of his whiskey, eyes never leaving mine. "Tell me, you haven't thought about it," he murmured, his voice just low enough that only I could hear. I didn't answer, because the truth was, I had. Not just tonight, not just at this party. It had been creeping in for months, maybe longer. Lingering glances, accidental touches. The way his eyes would darken when he looked at me just a second too long. I turned away, gripping the stem of my glass tighter, as if that would steady me. "You're drunk," I said, trying to dismiss it, trying to convince myself that this was nothing more than a passing moment, a fleeting temptation. Not even close. And I knew he wasn't. Mark could hold his liquor better than anyone. He knew exactly what he was saying, what he was doing, and so did I. A sudden gust of wind sent a chill through me, or maybe it was the weight of his stare. My skin felt hot, too tight. I needed to get away, put distance between us before I did something reckless. But even as I told myself to walk away, my feet wouldn't move. "You're playing with fire," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the hum of the party. Mark smirked, the corner of his mouth twitching upward. "Maybe, but I think you like the heat." A flush crept up my neck, not just from the wine. I hated how well he read me, hated how much I wanted to hear what else he had to say. Before I could respond, Olivia's voice cut through the air. "There you are!" I jolted, stepping back as if I'd been caught doing something wrong. Olivia beamed at me, her blue eyes sparkling. "Come with me. I need to introduce you to someone." Mark's gaze stayed locked onto mine as Olivia tugged me away, blissfully unaware. My heart pounded as I followed her, trying to shake the feeling that something irreversible had just been set in motion. And worse, I wasn't sure I wanted to stop it. I spent the rest of the evening trying to act normal, but my mind was racing. Every time Olivia laughed, every time Mark's voice rumbled in the distance, my skin prickled with something I didn't want to name. Temptation, anticipation, guilt, all tangled together in a messy knot I couldn't ignore. After a polite but forgettable introduction to some man Olivia swore I'd hit it off with. I excused myself and wandered to the back patio for some air. The night was cool, the moon casting a soft glow over the manicured lawn. It should have been peaceful, but I was anything but. I heard him before I saw him. The slow, deliberate steps, the way the air seemed to shift when he was near. "You ran away." I turned, finding Mark leaning against the railing, whiskey in hand, watching me with that same intensity that had stolen my breath earlier. I needed air. Is that what we're calling it? I should have walked away right then, told him to go back inside to his wife, to the life they had built together. But I stayed. "You shouldn't say things like that," I murmured, my fingers gripping the railing behind me as if I needed the support. "Why not?" He took a step closer, the scent of whiskey and something distinctly him filling the space between us. "Because it's true?" I exhaled slowly. "Because it's dangerous." Mark studied me, taking a slow sip of his drink. "Maybe danger is what you want." A shiver ran down my spine, and I hated that he was right, that some reckless, hidden part of me was drawn to this, to him. "I'm not some bored housewife looking for a thrill, Mark." "No," he agreed. "You're something else entirely." I swallowed hard, my heartbeat drumming in my ears. "Olivia," he cut me off, "is inside, laughing, happy, unaware." A rush of something dark and forbidden coursed through me. "That's supposed to make this better?" "No," he admitted. "It just makes it real." I turned my head away, trying to regain some semblance of control, but he was too close. Every fiber of my body was hyper-aware of him. The way his gaze lingered on my lips, the way his hand brushed the railing inches from mine. "We should go back inside." My voice lacked conviction, and we both knew it. Mark reached for my hand, the touch barely there, but enough to make me tremble. "Do you want to?" I should have said yes. I should have stepped away, laughed it off, walked back inside and forgotten this moment ever happened. But instead, I hesitated. And in that hesitation, everything shifted. The sound of laughter drifted through the patio doors. Someone called Mark's name from inside. He didn't move. Neither did I. "I need to think," I whispered, my throat dry, my hands unsteady. Mark's lips curved, just slightly. "Take your time. I'm not going anywhere." And with that, he stepped back, giving me space I wasn't sure I wanted, and disappeared into the house. I stood there, heart pounding, my body alive with something I hadn't felt in years. And I knew this wasn't over. Not even close. My mind kept looping through what had just happened. I couldn't forget the way Mark's voice had dipped into something deeper, heavier. I couldn't ignore the way his words had curled around me like smoke. The kind that lingers even after you try to clear it. I wasn't sure what it was that kept me standing there, on that patio long after he left. Was it confusion, curiosity, or something more dangerous? I took a deep breath, looking out over the well-lit yard. Olivia's party was still in full swing, voices floating out every time someone opened the sliding doors. I tried to convince myself that this was a one-off thing, that maybe Mark had been drunker than I realized, or maybe I'd imagined the weight behind his words. But I knew better. It wasn't the first time I'd felt his eyes on me, even in a crowded room. It wasn't the first time his presence had made me feel like I was standing a little closer to the edge than I should be. When I finally went back inside, I was met with a blur of faces and laughter, but none of it seemed real. Olivia spotted me almost immediately, her warm smile cutting through my fog of thoughts. "Where have you been?" she asked, looping her arm through mine. Her voice was light, teasing, like she was trying to pull me back into the normalcy of the evening. "Just needed some air," I said, forcing a smile. It wasn't entirely a lie. "Well, you're missing all the fun. Come on, you have to try these hors d'oeuvres." She led me back to the kitchen, her happiness so genuine it made my chest tighten. Mark was there too, leaning casually against the counter with his drink in hand. He looked up as we entered, his gaze flickering over me just long enough to send a shiver down my spine. Olivia didn't seem to notice. She was too busy chatting, introducing me to a couple of her colleagues from work. I nodded along, smiling where appropriate, but my attention kept slipping. Mark was right there, close enough that I could hear the low timbre of his voice as he joined the conversation. Close enough that I could feel the unspoken tension stretching between us. Even though we weren't speaking, it felt like hours before the party started winding down. Guests began saying their goodbyes, gathering their coats, and exchanging pleasantries as they left. I helped Olivia tidy up, mostly to keep my hands busy. But every now and then, I caught Mark's eyes on me. He wasn't looking at me like a man who regretted what he'd said. If anything, he looked like someone who was waiting. When the last guest left, Olivia collapsed onto the couch with a sigh. "I swear, hosting parties is more exhausting than going to them," she said with a laugh. "But it was worth it. I think everyone had a good time." I smiled and nodded, trying to match her energy, but my mind was still spinning. Mark was in the kitchen, putting the last of the glasses in the dishwasher. I could hear the soft clink of glass against metal, the quiet efficiency of his movements. Olivia seemed oblivious, leaning back against the cushions with a contented sigh. "I should probably head home," I said finally, standing up and brushing non-existent crumbs from my skirt. Olivia gave me a sleepy smile. "Thanks for all your help tonight. I don't know what I'd do without you." The words felt heavy, even though she meant them sincerely. I forced another smile. "Anytime." I grabbed my coat and purse, heading for the door. Mark appeared just as I was slipping my arm through the sleeve of my coat. His expression was unreadable, his posture relaxed, but his eyes told a different story. "Let me walk you out," he said, his voice low enough that Olivia didn't stir from her spot on the couch. My heart jumped into my throat, but I nodded. "Sure." The cool night air hit me as we stepped outside, and for a moment, I felt like I could breathe again. But then Mark closed the door behind us, and the weight of the moment settled over me once more. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he walked me to my car in silence, his hands tucked into his pockets. I could feel the tension humming between us, a charged current that neither of us seemed willing to break. When we reached my car, I turned to face him, unsure of what I was supposed to say. He beat me to it. "Did I scare you?" he asked, his voice soft but direct. I hesitated, my fingers tightening around my keys. "A little." His lips twitched into a small, almost sad smile. "I didn't mean to. I just couldn't keep it to myself anymore." I searched his face, looking for some hint of insincerity, some sign that he was playing some twisted game, but all I saw was a man who looked lost, and maybe that was what scared me the most. "Mark, this is complicated." "Of course it is. And wrong. I know." I shook my head, stepping back until my back pressed against the cool metal of my car. "You love Olivia. You have to. She's incredible." His eyes softened, and for a moment, I thought he might agree, but then he shook his head. "I do love her, but it's not the same as it used to be. That's not a reason." "No," he said quietly. "It's not, but I don't think I'm looking for reasons anymore." My chest felt tight, like I couldn't get enough air. "I don't know what you want from me, Mark." "I don't know either," he admitted. "I just know I can't stop thinking about you." His words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. I should have been angry. I should have told him to go back inside, to forget this ever happened. But all I could feel was the way my pulse quickened, the way my skin heated under his gaze, and I hated myself for it. "This can't happen," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "I know." "Then we're done talking." Mark didn't move, his eyes searching mine. "If that's what you want." I nodded, my heart pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. "It's what I want." He stepped back, his hands still in his pockets. "Good night." I climbed into my car, locking the doors, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I didn't start the engine until I saw him turn and walk back to the house. Only then did I let out the breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Driving home, I tried to make sense of what had just happened. The smart thing to do would be to never speak to Mark again, to avoid him, to pretend this night never happened. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple, because as much as I hated to admit it, I wasn't sure I wanted to. It had been a week since the party, and every day since, I'd been carrying the weight of that night around with me. No matter how much I tried to push it from my mind, I couldn't stop thinking about Mark. The way he looked at me, the way his words lingered, his voice still echoing in my head. I hated how much he consumed my thoughts, how much he pulled me into this restless, breathless state. I told myself it was nothing, a mistake, a moment of weakness that wouldn't happen again. But the tension hadn't gone away, not even a little. And when I saw him again, it was like no time had passed at all. I was at Olivia's place for dinner, just a casual weeknight meal she'd thrown together, inviting me over like she had so many times before. Olivia had always been that friend I could rely on, the one who opened her home to me without hesitation. I wasn't sure how much longer I could look her in the eye. Mark was already there when I arrived. He was at the stove, helping Olivia with some final touches, wearing that same easy confidence he always had. His presence filled the room the moment I walked in, and I found myself holding my breath. "Hey, you made it," Olivia said, pulling me into a hug. She smelled like lavender and rosemary, her signature blend. Her smile was warm and genuine, and for a moment, I felt safe. I glanced at Mark, who looked up briefly from the pan he was stirring. His expression was neutral, almost cool. But when our eyes met, something flickered, something only I seemed to notice. "Good to see you," he said, his voice steady, calm. It was as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't shattered my world with a few words whispered in the dark. "Good to see you too," I replied, my voice barely audible. Olivia chattered on about her day, about work and a new project she was excited about. I nodded, made polite comments, but my focus kept shifting. Every time Mark moved closer to the stove, every time his hand reached for a knife or a spoon, I was acutely aware of him, of the space he took up, of the memory of his hand brushing mine. Dinner was a blur. I barely tasted the food. I barely heard the conversation. I was too busy trying not to look at him, too busy trying to keep my hands from trembling as I reached for my glass of wine. Olivia seemed oblivious, laughing and telling stories, while I struggled to keep up. Mark stayed quiet for the most part. He let Olivia do the talking, only chiming in here and there. But every so often, I'd feel his gaze on me. Just a glance, just a moment, but it was enough to set my nerves on edge. When the meal was over, I volunteered to help clean up. I needed something to do, something to keep my mind off the way he was watching me. Olivia protested at first, insisting I was a guest, but I waved her off. "I don't mind," I said. "Really?" Olivia smiled, then grabbed her phone. "Okay, but I'm going to check my emails while you two handle the dishes." The moment she left the room, the air shifted. The sounds of running water and clinking plates filled the silence, but I could feel Mark's presence beside me. He was too close, his shoulder brushing mine as he reached for a towel. "I wasn't sure you'd come tonight," he said, his voice low. I glanced at him, startled. "Why wouldn't I?" His eyes met mine, steady and unreadable. "I thought maybe you'd want to avoid me." I swallowed hard, focusing on the plate in my hand. "I'm here for Olivia." His lips twitched, but he didn't argue. Instead, he reached past me to place a plate on the rack, his arm grazing mine in the process. My skin burned where he touched me, and I hated that I wanted more. "You've been on my mind," he said softly. I turned sharply, my voice a harsh whisper. "You can't say things like that." "Why not? It's the truth." I shook my head, stepping back, my heart pounding. "You're married to my best friend. This is wrong." He didn't deny it. Instead, He leaned against the counter, his gaze never leaving mine. Maybe, but I can't help how I feel. I pressed my hands against the counter behind me, as if it could hold me steady. You need to stop. Whatever this is, whatever you think this is, it has to end now. Mark's jaw tightened, his eyes darkening. Do you really want it to? I hated that he was making me question myself. I hated that a part of me wanted to say no, but I couldn't. I wouldn't. Yes, I said, my voice firm despite the trembling in my chest. This ends here. He studied me for a long moment, then nodded. If that's what you want. It is. He straightened, the moment passing like a cloud blocking the sun. The tension lingered, but the intensity faded. I exhaled slowly, trying to regain my composure. Olivia walked back in, phone in hand, smiling. Everything okay in here? I plastered on a smile, nodding quickly. Fine. Just finishing up. Mark handed Olivia a towel, his expression unreadable. All set. She beamed at both of us, oblivious to the storm that had just passed through the kitchen. You two are the best. Thanks for helping. I left shortly after, mumbling something about an early meeting the next day. Olivia hugged me at the door, her gratitude sincere and warm. Mark stood behind her, his hands shoved into his pockets, his expression neutral. Good night, I said quickly, avoiding his gaze. Good night, he replied, his voice even. I drove home in silence, my mind racing. I told myself it was over, that I'd made it clear, but a small, nagging voice in the back of my mind kept whispering that it wasn't that simple. It never was. It wasn't supposed to go this far. That's what I kept telling myself, over and over again, as if the repetition could somehow change what had already happened. I thought I could walk away, could say no, could keep things from spiraling out of control. But when Mark called me that afternoon, his voice low and steady, something in me gave way. Can we talk? He asked, as if the question itself was innocent, as if talking wouldn't be the start of everything. I hesitated, the silence stretching too long. I don't think that's a good idea. Please, just that single word. It didn't sound like a plea. It sounded like a command, cloaked in softness, and I hated that my body responded to it. Okay, I said finally, against my better judgment. We agreed to meet at a quiet coffee shop just outside of town, neutral territory, where no one would know us. It felt safer that way. But as I sat in my car, staring at the entrance, I knew there was no safety in this. There never had been. When I walked in, he was already there. He sat at a small table near the window, hands wrapped around a coffee cup, staring out at the street. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, and the sunlight caught the lines of his forearms, the curve of his jaw. He looked up as I approached, and for a moment, I forgot how to breathe. Hi, he said, his voice warm but cautious. Hi. I slid into the seat across from him, avoiding his gaze. My hands were clasped in my lap, my heart pounding too hard. I didn't mean to push you, he began, but I held up a hand. Let's just get this over with, I said. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. Mark's lips pressed into a thin line, but he nodded. I can't stop thinking about you, he admitted. I've tried. I've told myself to let it go, to focus on my marriage, but it's no use. You're always there, in the back of my mind. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. You have to stop this. Whatever this is, it's not real. It's not worth destroying everything you have. Maybe it's not real, he said. Maybe it's just a fantasy, something I'm clinging to because I don't know how to let go. But it feels real. You feel real. I shook my head, my hands trembling. You don't know me. Not really. I know enough, he said. I know that you make me feel alive in a way I haven't felt in years. My chest tightened, the weight of his words pressing down on me. You're just unhappy. That's all this is. You're looking for something, someone, to fix that. But it's not me. He leaned forward, his eyes intense. What if it is? It's not, I said firmly, my voice rising. You have a wife. You have a life. You made a choice, and you have to live with it. His jaw clenched, and for a moment, I thought he might argue, but then he sat back, exhaling slowly. You're right, he said quietly. I made a choice, and I've been trying to convince myself that it was the wrong one. But maybe it wasn't. The relief that washed over me was so sudden, so overwhelming that I almost cried. You need to focus on Olivia, I said. You need to fix what's broken in your marriage, not look for a way out. Mark nodded, his expression unreadable. You're a good person, he said after a long pause. I'm sorry I put you in this position. I shook my head. I'm not a good person. I'm just trying to do the right thing. And you are, he said. You're doing the right thing. I stood up, my hands trembling. Take care of her, Mark. Take care of your wife. I will, he said. And for the first time, I believed him. I walked out of the coffee shop, the weight on my chest finally lifting. I had made a mistake, many mistakes, but I had also made the right choice. And as I drove away, I knew that this was the end of something. The end of a fantasy. The end of a chapter that should never have begun. I had finally found my way back to myself, and that was all that mattered.